Russian opposition leader and Putin opponent Alexei Navalny has been reported dead by the Russian prison system. Navalny was serving a 19-year prison sentence on charges of extremism, charges he claimed were political. Navalny was last seen just yesterday on this Russian court video feed where he appeared by video link. He was even seen laughing and joking with the court. However, today, the prison system announced he has died after collapsing at the penal colony north of the Arctic Circle, where he was jailed. There has been plenty of reaction and finger-pointing. Joining me now to talk more about Navalny's death is Canada's ambassador to the United Nations, Bob Rae. Good to see you, Ambassador Rae.
Thank you very much, Michael. Good to be with you.
You have been unequivocal about who you believe is responsible for the death of Alexei Navalny. Why are you so sure?
Well, it's like if it quacks like a duck, it's probably a duck. Mr. Putin is a dictator. He is running his country into the ground. He's attacking other countries. He's responsible for the death of hundreds of thousands of people with his attack on Ukraine, including his own soldiers. And he's running a very brutal dictatorship that's reminiscent of what Stalin did and what was continued under the Soviet Union. So I agree entirely with President Biden. I don't see how you can say that in a dictatorship like Russia's, anyone else is responsible. I mean, Mr. Navalny was the opposite of an extremist. He was a Democrat. He believed in freedom of speech. He wanted his country to be a democratic country. In a dictatorship, being a Democrat means you're an extremist. But it doesn't mean the rest of us should adopt that language. He's not an extremist. He was somebody who died for his beliefs and his beliefs that he wanted his country to be a democratic place. And that's really what the stakes are. He's not the first one to have been killed by Putin. Nemtsov, who was leader of the opposition and who I met with in Parliament 10 years ago, was brutally murdered on the streets of Moscow by the security forces. Security forces have poisoned people. They've thrown people out of windows, and they've thrown tens of thousands of people in jail. So I don't know who else you call responsible if it's not the guy in charge. Mr. Putin is in charge of Russia. He's responsible. That's why he's being taken on by the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court. If kids are being kidnapped out of Ukraine, he's responsible. Why is he responsible? Because he's at the top of the chain of command.
Yeah, and Western allies have been warning Vladimir Putin to reverse course in his war in Ukraine for the last 2 years. Now, that clearly isn't happening. So how should allies now navigate someone who is so undeterred?
Well, you deter him. I mean, I think what we cannot, this is not a moment at which we can possibly weaken. We cannot appease this dictator. Appeasing dictators has been tried before. It never, ever works. Whenever it's been tried, it's failed miserably. And we need to learn from our own history. We need to learn from our own experience. The only way to deal with a dictator is to stand up to a dictator. And the only way to deal with an aggressor is to stand up to an aggressor. And we cannot weaken in our resolve. And if some people in the American Congress or elsewhere don't get it, that's no reason for us not to get it. We have to double down in our efforts to defeat Mr. Putin. That's exactly what we have to do.
I'll get to that in just a moment, but U.S. President Joe Biden had said back in 2021, he warned Putin that there would be devastating consequences if Navalny died. In your mind, what should be the next step here?
Well, I think we have to be clear in our own minds that Putin is not deterred by words. Putin is deterred by deeds. And the challenge that we all have, and President Biden has at the moment with the U.S. Congress, is that there are always going to be negative, timid voices who look for a way out. And the fact is, when you're dealing with somebody like Mr. Putin, there is no other way out than to take him on. He cannot be allowed to win, and he cannot be allowed to defeat us because his aggression really doesn't know any limits. He's an aggressor in Africa. He's already laid out clear that he's taking on Latvia. He's taking on the Baltic countries. In his interview the other day, he took on Poland. So we need to understand who we're dealing with. We're dealing with an aggressor, and we're dealing with a dictator. And there's no way you can compromise in your response to that. You have to take him on.
So when you say take him on, does that mean Canada should be plotting new sanctions against Russia and his regime?
I think obviously we have to keep on with sanctions, but we have to do more than that. We have to make sure that the Ukrainians have the means and the ability to stop Mr. Putin's aggression. And it means we have to be doing everything we can to encourage our American friends and to encourage our European friends that we need to double down together. Canada can't stand back and say, well, we'd like you to do more. We need to do more ourselves. And we are doing more. We are putting on new sanctions. We are finding new ways of holding Mr. Putin responsible for what's happened. But we can't do is we can't give up. I think what Winston Churchill has said, when you're walking through hell, keep going. We have to keep going. We're going through a very difficult time. The world is in a troubled space at the present time. Mr. Navalny's death is just another indication of that, but we can't afford to give up.
So does that mean Canada will be announcing new sanctions following this? And is there anything that you can share with us about that right now?
No, I can't share anything new with you except to say that I know that some sanctions are something that we have used to some effect in conjunction with our allies. But I also think it's a matter of meeting the military threat in a much more direct way and doing everything we can to support Ukraine's military resistance to Mr. Putin's aggression.
So what does that look like in your mind? Does that mean Canada is sending more military help than we are right now? Or is that also Canada calling on our allies to do more? Because I think we can call on our allies, but a lot of people will look at us and say, well, shouldn't you lead? Shouldn't you do more? Even though Canada is leading that battle group in Latvia.
Yeah, we're doing stuff. We're doing things that are important, but we need to do more of it, and we need to keep doing it. And we can't listen to those voices who say this is not our fight, or we don't think we should be spending more money on this effort. The reality is we have no choice but to try to stop Mr. Putin. And if, frankly, we can't persuade others unless we're doing it ourselves. And I know that's something the government wants to do and the government will continue to do. But we have to keep going in this effort. We cannot give up, and we cannot let this guy off the hook. We have to keep going.
Yeah, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the sanctions. In June of 2022, while imposing sanctions on Russian oil, gas, and chemical industries, a statement from Melanie Joly's office said these measures will reduce Russia's ability to wage war. Now, the latest data from the Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air shows that the EU continues to be the largest buyer of liquefied natural gas from Russia and the largest buyer of pipeline gas. So Russia's fossil fuel revenues are down slightly, but do you think that there's an issue with how effective these sanctions really have been on Russia?
Well, I think we all recognize that every instrument we use that is indirect, like sanctions, is an imperfect instrument. But we also have to recognize that those are things that can be tightened. And now that other supplies are coming on board, I hope that European dependence on Russian oil and gas will decline. And I hope that other countries will look at what Russia is doing and understand that they are equally vulnerable to the kinds of attacks that Russia has made on Ukraine. So, yeah, double down the efforts. That applies to us. It also applies to everybody else.
Is it double down or triple down? And I say that because the International Monetary Fund is predicting that Russia's GDP is to rise more than 2.6% this year. The World Bank is predicting slower growth at 1.3%, but it's still growth, not contraction. Do you feel that things need to be ratcheted up even more so now because all of those funds that were going from LNG and from oil and gas were supposed to be the thing that were cutting off the war machine, but those numbers don't really show that?
Well, I think one has to recognize that we're paying a price for previous dependence on Russia. It's not always possible to simply turn off the tap, as everyone knows. But I do think that overall, the sanctions have had an impact on Russia's ability to grow and Russia's ability to dominate. But I think the worrisome sign that I see is simply look at numbers that worry me. It's the numbers that indicate that an increasing number of Canadians and Americans and Europeans are not prepared to keep on paying the price of taking on Putin, and are looking for some kind of magic solution. There is no magic solution except for Russia's defeat, because if we think we can bargain with Putin, if we think you can make a deal with Putin, we're kidding ourselves. And this is not something we should be doing. We should get serious about what it's going to take to actually defeat Putin.
So I wanted to end on that. There is opposition in the U.S. It sounds like if you look at some of the polling here in Canada, there's a growing number of people who are saying that we are doing too much for Ukraine. What do you say to people in light of what has happened in the last 24 hours to counter that argument and to try and appeal to allies that Ukraine needs us now more than ever?
Well, I think it's very clear that anything that involves military expenditure can sometimes be controversial, and Canadians have a strong desire for peace. We all understand that. But the reality is that when you're dealing with a dictator, the language of peace doesn't work. The language of appeasement doesn't work. And the language of compromise doesn't work. And so we have to carry on, because the consequence of allowing Putin to get away with his aggression in Ukraine, the consequence will be in the rest of Europe, no one will be safe. Even for Canada, when we look at the Arctic, there's no guarantee of security. And you're strengthening the hands of a dictator. And that is not something we can afford to do. So we just have to double down our resolve. If you like, triple down, quadruple down, quintuple down, whatever you want. We've got to get serious about actually defeating Putin's aggression. And that's going to take an additional effort from everyone, including us.